The Nile Iaro, ancient Egyptian. Payanitaru, is a major north-flowing river in northeastern Africa, generally regarded as the longest river in the world. It is 6,853 kilometers long. The Nile is an international river as its water resources are shared by 11 countries, namely, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Congo-Kinshasa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, South Sudan, Sudan and Egypt. In particular, the Nile is the primary water source of Egypt and Sudan. The Nile has two major tributaries, the White Nile and Blue Nile. The White Nile is considered to be the headwaters and primary stream of the Nile itself. The Blue Nile, however, is the source of most of the water and silt. The White Nile is longer and rises in the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, with the most distant source still undetermined but located in either Rwanda or Burundi. It flows north through Tanzania, Lake Victoria, Uganda and South Sudan. The Blue Nile begins at Lake Tana in Ethiopia and flows into Sudan from the southeast. The two rivers meet near the Sudanese capital of Khartoum. The northern section of the river flows north almost entirely through the Sudanese desert to Egypt, then ends in a large delta and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. Egyptian civilization and Sudanese kingdoms have depended on the river since ancient times. Most of the population and cities of Egypt lie along those parts of the Nile Valley north of Aswan, and nearly all the cultural and historical sites of ancient Egypt are found along riverbanks. In the ancient Egyptian language, the Nile is called Payoritaru, meaning river, represented by the hieroglyphs shown on the left. In Coptic, the words Piaro or Phiro meaning the river, Hiro, the canal-great, come from the same ancient name. The English name Nile and the Arabic names Nil and Nil both derive from the Latin nilus and the ancient Greek nu epsilon lambda omicron sigma. Beyond that, however, the etymology is disputed. One possible etymology derives it from a Semitic Nahal, meaning river. The standard English names, White Nile and Blue Nile, to refer to the river's source, derive from Arabic names formerly applied only to the Sudanese stretches which meet at Khartoum. Course. Above Khartoum, the Nile is also known as the White Nile, a term also used in a limited sense to describe the section between Lake No and Khartoum. At Khartoum the river is joined by the Blue Nile. The White Nile starts in equatorial East Africa, and the Blue Nile begins in Ethiopia. Both branches are on the western flanks of the East African Rift. The drainage basin of the Nile covers 3,254,555 square kilometers, about 10% of the area of Africa. The Nile basin is complex, and because of this, the discharge at any given point along the main stem depends on many factors including weather, diversions, evaporation and evapotranspiration, and groundwater flow. The source of the Nile is sometimes considered to be Lake Victoria, but the lake has feeder rivers of considerable size. The Kagera River, which flows into Lake Victoria near the Tanzanian town of Bukoba, is the longest feeder, although sources do not agree on which is the longest tributary of the Kagera and hence the most distant source of the Nile itself. It is either the Ruvuronza, which emerges in Bururi Province, Burundi, or the Nyabarongo, which flows from Nungwe Forest in Rwanda. The two feeder rivers meet near Rusumo Falls on the Rwanda-Tanzania border. In 2010, an exploration party went to a place described as the source of the Rukara tributary, and by hacking a path up steep jungle-choked mountain slopes in the Nungwe forest found an appreciable incoming surface flow for many kilometers upstream, and found a new source. giving the Nile a length of 6,758 kilometers. Gishabe is reportedly the place where the holy water of the first drops of the Nile develop. Lost headwaters, formerly Lake Tanganyika, drained northwards along the African Rift Valley into the White Nile, making the Nile about 1,400 kilometers longer, until it was blocked in Miocene times by the bulk of the Virunga volcanoes. In Uganda, the Nile leaves Lake Nyanza at Ripon Falls near Jinja, Uganda, as the Victoria Nile. It flows north for some 130 kilometers to Lake Kyoga. The last part of the approximately 200 kilometers river section starts from the western shores of the lake and flows at first to the west until just south of Masindi Port, where the river turns north, then makes a great half-circle to the east and north until Karama Falls. For the remaining part it flows merely westernly through the Murchison Falls until it reaches the very northern shores of Lake Albert, where it forms a significant river delta. The lake itself is on the border of Dr. Congo, but the Nile is not a border river at this point. After leaving Lake Albert, the river continues north through Uganda and is known as the Albert Nile. In South Sudan, the river flows into South Sudan just south of Nimule, where it is known as the Bahr al-Jabal. Just south of the town it has the confluence with the Achwa River. The Bahr al-Ghazal, itself 716 kilometers long, joins the Bahr al-Jabal at a small lagoon called Lake No, after which the Nile becomes known as the Bahr al-Abyad, or the White Nile, from the whitish clay suspended in its waters. When the Nile floods, it leaves a rich silty deposit which fertilizes the soil. The Nile no longer floods in Egypt since the completion of the Aswan Dam in 1970. An unbranched river, the Bahr el-Zirif, flows out of the Nile's Bahr al-Jabal section and rejoins the White Nile. The flow rate of the Bahr al-Jabal at Mongala, South Sudan is almost constant throughout the year and averages 1,048 cubic meters per second. After Mongala, the Bahr al-Jabal enters the enormous swamps of the Sud region of South Sudan. More than half of the Nile's water is lost in this swamp to evaporation and transpiration. The average flow rate of the White Nile at the tails of the swamps is about 510 cubic meters per second. From here it soon meets with the Sabat River at Moluccal. On an annual basis, the White Nile upstream of Moluccal contributes about 15% of the total outflow of the Nile River. The average flow of the White Nile at Moluccal, just below the Sabat River, is 924 cubic meters per second. The peak flow is approximately 1,218 cubic meters per second in October, and minimum flow is about 609 cubic meters per second in April. This fluctuation is due to the substantial variation in the flow of the Sabat, which has a minimum flow of about 99 cubic meters per second in March and a peak flow of over 680 cubic meters per second in October. During the dry season, the White Nile contributes between 70% and 90% of the total discharge from the Nile. In Sudan below rank, the White Nile enters Sudan. It flows north to Khartoum and meets the Blue Nile. The course of the Nile in Sudan is distinctive. It flows over 6 groups of cataracts, from the first at Aswan to the sixth at Sabaloka, and then turns to flow southward before again returning to flow north. One name for this is the Great Bend. In the north of Sudan, the river enters Lake Nasser, the larger part of which is in Egypt. In Egypt, below the Aswan High Dam, at the northern limit of Lake Nasser, the Nile resumes its historic course. North of Cairo, the Nile splits into 2 branches that feed the Mediterranean. The Rosetta branch to the west and the Damietta to the east, forming the Nile Delta. Tributaries. At Barra River below the confluence with the Blue Nile, the only major tributary is the Atbara River, roughly halfway to the sea, which originates in Ethiopia north of Lake Tana, and is around 800 kilometers long. The Atbara flows only while there is rain in Ethiopia and dries very rapidly. During the dry period of January to June, it typically dries up. It joins the Nile approximately 300 kilometers north of Khartoum. Blue Nile. The Blue Nile to Ethiopians, Arabic, transliterated, and Nil al-Azriq, springs from Lake Tana in the Ethiopian highlands. The Blue Nile flows about 1,400 kilometers to Khartoum, where the Blue Nile and White Nile join to form the Nile. 90% of the water and 96% of the transported sediment carried by the Nile originates in Ethiopia, with 59% of the water from the Blue Nile. The erosion and transportation of silt only occurs during the Ethiopian rainy season in the summer. However, the flow of the Blue Nile varies considerably over its yearly cycle and is the main contribution to the large natural variation of the Nile flow. During the dry season, the natural discharge of the Blue Nile can be as low as 113 cubic meters per second, although upstream dams regulate the flow of the river. During the wet season, the peak flow of the Blue Nile often exceeds 5,663 cubic meters per second in late August. Before the placement of dams on the river, the yearly discharge varied by a factor of 15 at Aswan. Peak flows of over 8,212 cubic meters per second occurred during late August and early September, and minimum flows of about 552 cubic meters per second occurred during late April and early May. The Bahr al-Ghazal's drainage basin is the largest of any of the Nile sub-basins, measuring 520,000 square kilometers in size, but it contributes a relatively small amount of water, about 2 cubic meters per second annually, due to tremendous volumes of water being lost in the Sud wetlands. The Sabat River, which joins the Nile a short distance below Lake No, drains about half as much land, 225,000 square kilometers, but contributes 412 cubic meters per second annually to the Nile. When in flood, the Sabat carries a large amount of sediment, adding greatly to the White Nile's color. Yellow Nile. The Yellow Nile is a former tributary that connected the Wadi highlands of eastern Chad to the Nile River Valley c. 8000 to c. 1000 BC. Its remains are known as the Wadi Hawa. The wadi passes through Garb Darfur near the northern border with Chad and meets up with the Nile near the southern point of the Great Bend.